when a young settler woman defied her entire wagon train to save a dying Comanche warrior. She never imagined that the enemy's medicine would become the key to saving her own people's children. But as deadly fever swept through the camp and desperate families turned to the very savage remedies they'd once condemned, Margaret Whitfield faced an impossible choice. Would she risk everything to heal those who had cast her out? The smell of burning bacon fat made Margaret Whitfield's stomach growl as she crept between the wagons in the gray light before dawn. 1859 had been a hard year for everyone heading west to California, but it had been especially cruel to orphans. She clutched a tin cup in her dirt-stained hands, hoping someone might spare a few drops of coffee before the day's journey began. "Get away from there!" Mrs. Crawford's sharp voice cut through the morning quiet like a whip crack. "We've already given you people enough charity." Margaret's cheeks burned with shame, but she didn't back down. "My brother Benjamin is sick. He needs something warm to drink." "Should have thought of that before your parents died and left you as burdens on decent folks," Mrs. Crawford snapped, turning her back with a swish of her heavy brown skirt. The wagon train had been Margaret's whole world for 3 months now. 47 families, 162 people, and more than 200 head of cattle, all moving slowly across the endless grasslands toward a dream of gold and good farmland. But for Margaret and 10-year-old Benjamin, the dream had turned into a nightmare when cholera took their parents outside Fort Kearny. Margaret walked back to their small wagon, the last one in the long line. Benjamin was awake, coughing into a rag that showed spots of blood. His green eyes looked too bright in his pale face. "Did you get any food?" he whispered. Margaret forced a smile. "I'll find something. Don't worry." But worry was all she could do these days. The other families barely tolerated the orphaned siblings. Without a man to help with heavy work or provide protection, Margaret and Benjamin were seen as dead weight. Wagon Master Coleman had made it clear they could stay only as long as they didn't cause trouble. The problem was that Margaret's grandmother had taught her things that most white settlers called witchcraft, Cherokee healing ways, using plants and herbs that could cure sickness and ease pain. Back in Tennessee, these skills had been respected. Out here on the frontier, they made people nervous. "Margaret!" Dr. Williamson's urgent voice made her turn. The train's physician was hurrying toward their wagon, his black medical bag bouncing against his leg. "Mrs. Patterson's baby is burning with fever. Nothing I've tried is working." This was Margaret's chance. She grabbed her own medicine pouch, a soft leather bag filled with dried plants her grandmother had taught her to gather. "I can help." Dr. Williamson hesitated. He was a proper Boston-trained doctor, not some frontier herb woman. But the baby was dying, and desperate times called for desperate measures. Margaret knelt beside the tiny infant, feeling the dangerous heat radiating from the small body. She mixed willow bark with cool water, then gently dripped the bitter medicine between the baby's lips. Within an hour, the fever began to break. "How did you know to do that?" Dr. Williamson asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier doubt. "My grandmother learned from Cherokee healers. They taught her that willow bark fights fever better than anything else in nature." The doctor nodded slowly. "Perhaps there's wisdom in old ways after all." Word of the baby's recovery spread through the wagon train like wildfire. Some families began to look at Margaret with new respect. Others grew even more suspicious. Mrs. Crawford whispered that Margaret was probably in league with hostile Indians, using their dark magic to curse Christian folk. But Margaret didn't have time to worry about gossip. Benjamin's cough was getting worse, and she recognized the signs of lung fever. The same sickness that had weakened their father before cholera finished him off. As the sun climbed higher, the wagon train prepared to move. Margaret helped Benjamin into their wagon, noting how he struggled for breath. She would need to find the right herbs soon, or she might lose the only family she had left. The line of wagons began to roll, wheels creaking and harnesses jangling. Margaret walked alongside their oxen, watching the vast Texas grassland stretch endlessly ahead. Somewhere out there, hostile tribes watched their progress. Somewhere behind them, civilization grew farther away with each step. She touched the medicine pouch at her waist, feeling the dried plants that connected her to her grandmother's wisdom. These frontier families might not trust her Cherokee healing ways, but those same plants might be the only thing standing between them and death in this unforgiving wilderness. A cloud of dust appeared on the northern horizon, too organized to be wild animals. Margaret squinted against the bright morning sun, trying to make out shapes in the distance. Riders, moving fast, and they weren't wearing blue cavalry uniforms. "Coleman!" she called toward the front of the train. "Riders coming in from the north." The wagon master raised his telescope, studying the approaching dust cloud. When he lowered it, his face had gone pale. "Circle the wagons," he shouted. "Comanche war party." War cries split the morning air like thunder, as 30 painted warriors swept down from the hills surrounding the hastily formed wagon circle. Margaret pulled Benjamin behind their overturned wagon, her heart hammering as bullets and arrows began flying in both directions. "Stay down and don't move," she whispered fiercely in his ear. The attack was swift and brutal. Comanche warriors on painted ponies rode in tight circles around the wagon train, using their incredible horsemanship to fire arrows and rifles while staying low against their horses' necks. The settlers' return fire mostly hit empty air. Margaret pressed her face against the wagon wheel, trying to see what was happening. Through the chaos of smoke and dust, she spotted Jonas Fletcher's teenage son, William, lying motionless near the water barrels. Mrs. Patterson screamed as warriors tried to stampede the livestock. Old Peter Donnelly was reloading his rifle with shaking hands. Then something caught Margaret's eye that made her blood turn cold. One of the Comanche warriors had been thrown from his horse and lay crumpled behind a large boulder about 60 yards from the wagon circle. Even at this distance, she could see the dark stains spreading across his buckskin shirt. He was badly hurt and completely cut off from his war party. The warrior tried to sit up, one hand pressed against his side where blood seeped between his fingers. He looked young, maybe close to her own age of 19. His long black hair was streaked with war paint, and geometric tattoos covered his chest and arms. But what struck Margaret most was the look in his dark eyes, not the wild fury she expected from a savage, but pain and confusion. "He's hurt," she whispered to herself. "Good," Benjamin gasped between coughing fits. "Let him die." But Margaret couldn't stop staring at the wounded enemy. The way he pressed grass against his wound reminded her exactly of how Benjamin had tried to stop a cut on his hand last week. The warrior was someone's son, maybe someone's brother. He was bleeding and alone and probably terrified, just like she had been when their parents died. The main attack was moving away from their position now. The Comanche war party had grabbed about 20 head of cattle and was retreating toward the hills. In a few minutes, they would be gone, and they would leave their wounded companion behind to die. Margaret made a decision that went against everything the wagon train had taught her about survival. "Watch Benjamin," she told Mrs. Patterson, who was clutching her recovered baby nearby. Then she grabbed her medicine pouch and crawled out from behind the wagon. "Margaret, no!" Benjamin called after her, but she was already running across the open ground toward the boulder. The wounded warrior saw her coming and tried to raise his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. Margaret approached slowly, her hands visible and empty except for her leather medicine bag. "I want to help," she said softly, though she doubted he spoke English. Up close, she could see the wound was serious. A bullet had torn through the left side of his abdomen, and infection was already setting in around the edges. Without proper treatment, he would be dead by nightfall. The warrior studied her face with intelligent eyes, then spoke in rapid Comanche. When she shook her head to show she didn't understand, he switched to broken English. "Why, you help enemy?" Margaret knelt beside him, already pulling supplies from her medicine bag. "Because you're hurt, and I know how to fix hurt." She began cleaning the wound with water from her canteen, noting how the warrior tensed but didn't pull away. His skin was burning with fever, and she could see infection starting to poison his blood. This was exactly the kind of case where Cherokee healing methods worked better than white medicine. "Your people," he said weakly, gesturing toward the wagon train. "They want me dead." "My people want a lot of things," Margaret replied, mixing a poultice of yarrow and sage. "Doesn't mean they're right." The warrior watched her work with growing amazement. Margaret's hands were gentle but sure as she cleaned and bandaged his wound. She gave him willow bark tea for the fever and pain, then used her grandmother's technique of packing the wound with healing herbs. "What is name?" he asked, as his breathing became easier. Margaret Whitfield. "I am Dakota," he said. "Means friend to all." Margaret almost smiled at the irony. Here she was, making friends with a Comanche warrior, while her own people treated her like dirt. The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. The wagon train was sending out riders to check for wounded and missing people. In minutes, they would find Margaret, helping their enemy. "You must go," Dakota said urgently. "Your people punish you for this kindness." "Can you travel?" He struggled to sit up, wincing with pain but managing to stay upright. "I think so." Margaret helped him to his feet, noting how he swayed dangerously. The fever and blood loss had weakened him badly, but he might survive if he could reach his own people. "There," she pointed toward a distant line of trees. "Follow the creek north. Your war party went that direction." Dakota looked into her eyes with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out something that made Margaret gasp. It was a piece of jade, carved into the shape of a healing hand, smooth and green as spring water. He pressed it into her palm. "For medicine woman who sees with heart, not hatred," he said. Then he was gone, disappearing into the grassland like morning mist. Margaret clutched the jade carving and ran back toward the wagon train, her mind racing. She had just risked everything to save an enemy's life. The question now was whether that enemy might someday save hers. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Wagon Master Coleman's voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack, causing every person within 50 yards to freeze mid-task. His weathered face had turned the color of dried leather as he stared down at Margaret, who knelt beside the unconscious Comanche warrior she'd been tending since dawn. The attack had ended 3 hours ago, leaving 2 settlers dead and the entire camp on edge. Smoke still rose from a burned wagon, and children whimpered in their mother's arms. In this atmosphere of fear and grief, Margaret's act of mercy looked like the worst kind of betrayal. "He's badly hurt," Margaret replied, without looking up from where she was cleaning the warrior's wounds with willow bark tea. Her hands moved with practiced skill, the same way she'd tended her dying father during those terrible weeks of fever. "If we leave him here, infection will kill him within days." "Good riddance to bad rubbish," snarled Jonas Fletcher, whose wagon had lost an axle during the attack. The burly blacksmith's face bore fresh scratches from diving for cover behind his anvil. "You're giving aid and comfort to a savage, girl. This goes against everything decent and Christian." A crowd was forming now, drawn by Coleman's shouting. Margaret could feel their angry stares burning into her back, but she continued her work. The warrior's breathing had grown steadier since she'd given him feverfew tea, though his skin still burned with fever. Benjamin emerged from behind their wagon, carrying Margaret's leather medicine bag with both hands. At 10 years old, he barely reached most adults' shoulders, but his voice carried surprising strength. "My sister saved Mrs. Patterson's baby last winter, when Doc Williamson said there was nothing more to be done. She knows healing better than anyone on this train." "That baby was white," Mrs. Crawford snapped, her bonnet askew from the morning's chaos. "This is different." The wounded warrior's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Margaret's face with obvious confusion. He spoke in rapid Comanche, his voice weak but urgent. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone, questions mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "What's he saying?" demanded Fletcher, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his belt. "I don't speak Comanche," Margaret admitted, But pain sounds the same in any language. The warrior struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged wounds. He gestured toward his chest, then toward the sky, his dark eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Even without shared words, his meaning seemed clear, some kind of thanks, or perhaps a prayer. Coleman stepped closer, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. You realize what you've done, don't you? His people will come looking for him. When they find him here, in our care, what do you think happens to the rest of us? Maybe they'll remember that we showed mercy, Margaret said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. She'd acted on instinct, the same way she always did when faced with suffering. But Coleman wasn't wrong about the danger. Or maybe they'll see it as weakness and come back with twice as many warriors, Mrs. Crawford added, her voice rising toward hysteria. My children could die because of your soft heart. Dr. Williamson pushed through the crowd, his black medical bag clutched in one pale hand. The train's physician was a thin, nervous man who'd fled Boston after some unspecified trouble with his practice. He took one look at Margaret's handiwork and shook his head in disgust. Amateur doctoring, he pronounced. You've probably made his condition worse with those folk remedies. His fever's dropping, and the bleeding has stopped, Margaret pointed out. Temporary improvements at best. Williamson's voice carried the authority of formal education. Even though Margaret had noticed, he seemed to kill more patients than he saved. Savage constitutions are different from civilized folk. What works for us might poison him. The warrior spoke again, this time managing a few English words. No. Poison. Good. Medicine. A murmur ran through the crowd. Few had expected any Comanche to speak their language, and the admission changed the dynamic in ways Margaret couldn't quite grasp. Coleman rubbed his grizzled chin, clearly wrestling with a decision that could affect everyone's survival. The wagon train was already running behind schedule, and Indian attacks had made everyone jumpy. Yet abandoning a wounded man, even an enemy, went against the frontier code that kept civilization alive in wild places. Here's what's going to happen, Coleman announced finally. You've got until first light tomorrow to get him well enough to travel. If he can't ride out of here on his own by dawn, we leave him behind. And if his people come calling before then, he didn't finish the threat. But everyone understood. Margaret would bear responsibility for whatever happened next. That's fair, Margaret said, though her stomach twisted with worry. Healing took time, and pushing a badly wounded man too soon could undo everything she'd accomplished. Fair? Fletcher's voice cracked with outrage. Nothing about this is fair. We should put a bullet in him right now and be done with it. Then you're no better than the men who killed your friend this morning, Benjamin said quietly. The words hit Fletcher like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, as he struggled for a response. Finally, he turned and stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret found herself alone, with her patient and the weight of impossible expectations. She had less than 24 hours to heal wounds that should take weeks to mend properly. But as she looked down at the young warrior's face, peaceful now in sleep, she remembered her grandmother's words. Healing isn't just about medicine, child. Sometimes it's about showing folks there's another way to live. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and Margaret prepared for the longest day of her life. Thunder rolled across the Texas plains, even though no clouds marked the endless blue sky. Margaret looked up from grinding willow bark to see dust rising on the horizon, riders approaching fast from the east. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she counted at least a dozen horses, too many to be friendly visitors. Company's coming, she called to Benjamin, who was fetching water from the creek. The wagon train had stopped early today, partly because of yesterday's attack, and partly because Coleman wanted to be ready for whatever came next. Beside her, the wounded warrior who had managed to tell her his name was Dakota during one of his clearer moments, stirred from his afternoon rest. Despite her care, infection was setting into his wounds, bringing fever dreams that made him call out in his sleep. More of your people? Margaret asked, helping him sit up to drink the bitter tea she'd been forcing down his throat all day. Dakota squinted at the approaching dust cloud, his dark eyes focusing with effort. "No," he said, in careful English. "Soldiers. Many soldiers." Margaret's blood went cold. If a large cavalry patrol found Dakota here, they wouldn't waste time with questions. Soldiers shot first and sorted out the details later, especially when it came to Indians. "Can you stand?" she asked urgently. Dakota tried to rise but fell back with a gasp of pain. The movement had torn open his side wound again, sending fresh blood soaking through the bandages. Margaret pressed clean cloth against the injury, while her mind raced through impossible options. "Margaret!" Benjamin's voice carried panic as he ran back from the creek. "There's a whole company of cavalry heading this way, maybe 40 men." Around them, the wagon train erupted into nervous activity. Coleman shouted orders about defensive positions while families gathered their children close. The memory of this morning's attack was still fresh, making everyone jumpy and quick to assume the worst. "Listen to me," Margaret said, gripping Dakota's shoulders. "Those soldiers will kill you if they find you here, but you're too weak to run." Understanding flickered in his fever-bright eyes. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, frustration clear in his voice when she couldn't follow his meaning. Then he switched to broken English. "Hide me, please." Margaret looked around desperately. Their wagon offered little concealment, and the open prairie provided nowhere to run. But perhaps... She studied the layout of the camp with new eyes, noting how the other wagons were arranged in a rough circle around the central fire pit. "Benjamin, help me get him under our wagon," she whispered, "and bring every blanket we own." They worked quickly, half carrying Dakota to the space beneath their wagon bed. Margaret arranged their few possessions to create a hiding place, covering him with quilts and spare clothing. To any casual observer, it would look like storage space. "If they find him here, we're all dead," Benjamin observed with the matter-of-fact honesty that children possessed. "Then we make sure they don't find him," Margaret replied, though her voice shook slightly. The cavalry arrived with a thunder of hooves and jangling spurs. Captain Reynolds, a lean man with cold blue eyes, dismounted near Coleman's wagon while his troopers spread out through the camp. Margaret forced herself to continue grinding herbs as if nothing had changed, though every muscle in her body remained tense. "We're tracking a Comanche war party," Reynolds announced without preamble. "Intelligence suggests they hit your train this morning. Anyone see which direction they headed?" "North by northwest," Coleman replied, pointing toward the distant hills. "Hit us at dawn, killed 2 good men, then disappeared like smoke." Reynolds nodded, his gaze sweeping the camp with professional thoroughness. Margaret kept her eyes down, focusing on her mortar and pestle while praying that Dakota would remain unconscious and quiet. "Any wounded Indians left behind?" the captain asked. "Sometimes we find stragglers after these raids." "None that we've seen," Coleman lied smoothly. Margaret felt a flash of surprise the wagon master was protecting her secret despite his earlier anger. One of Reynolds' sergeants approached their wagon, his eyes drawn by Margaret's medical supplies. "What's all this, miss?" "Healing herbs," Margaret replied, meeting his stare calmly. "I help tend the sick and injured." The sergeant poked at her herb bundles with casual curiosity. "Learn this from your mother?" "My grandmother," Margaret said. She knew Cherokee medicine. Something in the soldier's expression shifted, becoming more interested. "Cherokee, eh? They make good medicine, I'll grant you that. Saved my life once during the Creek Wars." Relief flooded through Margaret as the sergeant moved on, without searching further. But her heart nearly stopped when she heard a faint cough from beneath the wagon, barely audible but enough to make her blood freeze. Reynolds' head turned sharply toward the sound. "What was that?" "Probably just settling wood," Coleman said quickly. "These old wagons creak and groan something fierce." The captain studied their wagon for another long moment, then shrugged and turned away. "Mount up," he called to his men. "We're burning daylight." As the cavalry rode away in a cloud of dust, Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe. But when she checked on Dakota, her relief turned to alarm. His fever was spiking again, and the stress of hiding had reopened his wounds. She had mere hours before his condition became critical. "The soldiers are gone," she whispered. "But now I need to save your life all over again." Dakota's eyes opened, focusing on her face with obvious effort. "Why?" he asked in English. "Why?" "Help enemy." Margaret considered the question as she prepared fresh bandages. Why was she risking everything for someone she'd never met before today? The answer came from somewhere deeper than logic. "Because," she said softly, "sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe." As darkness fell over the Texas plains, Margaret began the real fight for Dakota's life. Thunder rolled across the Texas plains, but it wasn't from the storm clouds gathering overhead. Dust kicked up by dozens of horse hooves announced trouble coming from two directions at once. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she spotted blue cavalry uniforms charging toward camp from the east, while 3 Comanche warriors materialized like ghosts on the western ridge. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," breathed old Pete Donnelly, dropping his coffee cup with a crash. "We're caught in the middle of a war." The entire camp erupted into chaos. Women grabbed their children while men reached for rifles. Margaret felt Benjamin's small hand slip into hers as they watched the two forces racing toward each other, with their wagon train directly in between. "Stay close to me," she whispered, pulling him toward their wagon where Dakota sat propped against the wheel. The young warrior's face had gone pale beneath his remaining paint, not from his wounds, but from recognizing the riders approaching from the west. "My uncle," he said in halting English, pointing toward the lead Comanche rider. "He comes for me." The cavalry reached them first. Lieutenant Morrison vaulted from his saddle with practiced military precision, his uniform dusty from hard riding. 6 soldiers spread out behind him, their weapons ready. Morrison's blue eyes swept the camp until they locked onto Dakota, and his expression turned to stone. "Miss, I'm ordering you to step away from that hostile immediately," Morrison commanded, his hand dropping to rest on his pistol grip. "He can't even stand up without help," Margaret replied, moving to place herself between the soldier and her patient. "He's not dangerous to anyone right now." "Not dangerous?" Morrison's voice rose loud enough for the whole camp to hear. "These painted savages just burned out the Walker homestead 2 days ago. Killed Jim Walker and his oldest boy. We've been tracking this war party across 3 counties." A collective gasp rose from the settlers. Margaret felt their eyes boring into her back, and she knew what they were thinking. She'd harbored a murderer. She'd risked all their lives for a killer. "This warrior was already wounded when I found him," Margaret said, though doubt crept into her voice. Had Dakota been part of that attack? Had her mercy been misplaced? "Indians don't fight alone, girl. They ride together, kill together, die together." Morrison drew his pistol but kept it pointed at the ground. "Now step aside, so I can finish what should have been done days ago." The 3 Comanche warriors had closed the distance during this exchange, stopping just beyond accurate rifle range. Margaret could see them clearly now. The leader was indeed older, with silver threading his black braids and scars, marking his weathered face. Beside him rode 2 younger men, both carrying rifles across their laps. Benjamin tugged at Margaret's skirt. "Sister, what if they try to take us prisoner? What if they blame us for capturing their friend?" Margaret hadn't considered that possibility. She might have saved Dakota's life, only to make herself and Benjamin targets for his people's revenge. The thought made her legs feel weak. The scarred leader called out in rapid Comanche, his voice carrying absolute authority. Dakota struggled to stand, using the wagon wheel for support. When he answered, his words sounded respectful but urgent, like a son explaining himself to a stern father. "What's he saying?" demanded Jonas Fletcher, whose wagon had been damaged in the original attack. "Is he calling for reinforcements?" Margaret watched the exchange with growing dread. She understood nothing of the language, but she could read body language well enough. Dakota gestured toward her several times, then touched his healing wounds. The older warrior's expression remained unreadable as stone. "I don't think he's calling for help," she said slowly. "I think he's explaining." Morrison raised his pistol toward Dakota. "Enough talking," This ends now. Wait! Margaret threw herself in front of the gun. Let him translate. Let us understand what's happening before anyone else dies. The tension stretched so tight, Margaret could almost hear it humming in the air. Wagon Master Coleman had emerged from behind his wagon, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. Mrs. Crawford clutched her youngest child, while Jonas Fletcher aimed his hunting rifle at the mounted warriors. Dakota spoke again to his uncle, then turned to face both Morrison and the gathered settlers. His voice carried surprising strength, despite his injuries. I tell my uncle about Medicine Woman, he said in careful English, how she save enemy when her people say, let him die. This shows courage greater than warriors' courage. The older Comanche studied Margaret with intense dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When he finally spoke, his English was better than Margaret had expected. White Medicine Woman, show honor to wounded enemy. This makes her sacred person in our way of thinking. To harm healer is to bring curse on tribe. Morrison's gun hand shook slightly. You're saying she's under your protection now? She choose protection of the healing path. This path is sacred to all peoples, red and white. Any who harm her bring shame to their own people. Margaret felt the weight of something enormous settling on her shoulders. She'd thought she was simply helping an injured man, but somehow she'd stepped into a role that neither culture took lightly. The responsibility felt crushing. What does that mean for us? Coleman asked, his voice tight with worry. The scarred warrior considered this carefully. Medicine Woman travels with her people, we leave trail alone. But if soldiers or settlers harm Medicine Woman, he left the threat unspoken but clear. Morrison holstered his pistol with obvious reluctance. The military implications of this situation were beyond his authority to handle. A white woman under Comanche protection could prevent attacks, but she could also trigger them if anything happened to her. This is highly irregular, Morrison muttered. But I suppose there's been enough killing for 1 week. As the Comanche prepared to leave, Dakota limped toward their horses with obvious difficulty. Before mounting, he returned to Margaret one last time. He pressed something small and warm into her palm, a carved stone bear that felt ancient and powerful. For protection on your path, he said quietly, and to remember that enemies can become friends when healing happens. The 3 warriors rode away into the darkening sky, leaving behind only dust and the echo of promises made. Margaret opened her hand to study the tiny carved bear, its surface worn smooth by countless hands before hers. But when she looked up, she saw something that chilled her blood. The faces around her weren't filled with gratitude or relief. Instead, she saw fear, suspicion, and anger burning in eyes that had once looked at her with simple dislike. Lieutenant Morrison mounted his horse and leaned down to speak quietly to her. Miss, I don't know if what happened here today was genius or foolishness, but you've put yourself in a position where both sides are watching you now. That's either the safest place on the frontier or the most dangerous. As thunder rumbled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, Margaret tucked the stone bear into her apron pocket and wondered what she'd really accomplished. She'd saved a life and possibly prevented a massacre, but the cost was becoming clear in the hostile stares of her own people. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending settlers running for cover. But Margaret stood in the rain, feeling more alone than ever despite being surrounded by 47 other souls. Pack your things. You've got 1 hour. Wagon Master Coleman's words hit Margaret like a physical blow as she knelt beside their morning fire 3 days later. The smell of burning coffee grounds mixed with the bitter taste of betrayal in her mouth. Benjamin dropped the tin plate he'd been washing. What do you mean? We haven't done anything wrong. Around them, the usual morning sounds of the wagon train continued, children laughing, cattle lowing, adults planning the day's journey. But Margaret noticed how conversation stopped whenever families looked their way. The invisible wall of suspicion had grown thicker since the cavalry incident. Mrs. Crawford called for a vote last night. After you retired, Coleman explained, though he couldn't meet Margaret's eyes. The families are scared. They think keeping you around will bring more Indian trouble. Margaret's hands trembled as she folded their few belongings. Everything they owned could fit in 2 cloth bundles: a Bible, some cooking pots, her medicine supplies, and the clothes on their backs. The carved bear stone felt warm in her apron pocket, a reminder of the friendship that had cost them everything. "Where are we supposed to go?" Benjamin asked, his voice cracking with the effort not to cry. Coleman shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "There's a trading post about 40 miles north, Fort Patterson. You might find work there or catch another train heading west." The voting had happened around the Crawford wagon after evening prayers, while Margaret and Benjamin slept. Mrs. Crawford had spoken first, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose husband owned the largest wagon and most cattle in the train. "That girl has marked us all," she declared to the circle of worried faces lit by flickering firelight. "Every Indian from here to California knows we're harboring someone who helped their warriors. They'll track us like wolves following a blood trail." Mrs. Patterson, whose baby Margaret had delivered safely 2 months earlier, had tried to speak up. "But she's helped so many of us. Remember when little Johnny had the lung fever? The doctor said he wouldn't make it. But Margaret's herbs—" "Devil's medicine," interrupted Jonas Fletcher. "Who's to say those Indian herbs didn't cause more harm than good? Maybe she's been poisoning our children slowly all along." The fear in the circle grew like a living thing, fed by whispered stories and dark suspicions. Every unexplained illness, every accident, every piece of bad luck from the past months suddenly seemed connected to Margaret's presence. Old Peter Donnelly had defended her with passion. "You're all forgetting that this girl has saved more lives than she's ever endangered. My arthritis hasn't bothered me once since she started treating it with that willow bark tea." "Indian magic," Fletcher spat. "For all we know, she's been practicing witchcraft since Tennessee." The argument had raged for nearly 2 hours. Families split down the middle, with children sent to bed so adults could speak freely. Some remembered Margaret's kindnesses, the difficult birth she'd guided, the fevers she'd broken, the cuts and burns she'd healed with gentle hands and strange-smelling poultices. But others remembered the stories they'd heard about Indian raids, about captives taken in the night, about settlers found scalped and mutilated. Fear always shouted louder than gratitude. The final vote came near midnight. 16 families to expel Margaret and Benjamin. 11 to let them stay. 5 who refused to vote at all. Coleman had announced the decision with obvious reluctance, but a wagon master's authority depended on keeping the majority happy. Now Margaret found herself loading their possessions into a borrowed handcart, while 47 people, who'd shared meals and prayers with them for months, prepared to abandon them on the empty prairie. The injustice burned in her throat like swallowed smoke. "Margaret." Mrs. Crawford approached hesitantly, carrying a small flour sack tied with string. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much after the vote. "I brought you some supplies: hardtack, jerky, a little coffee and sugar. Keep it for your own family," Margaret replied, without looking up from packing their cooking pot. "You'll need every bit of food for the journey ahead. Please, I know this seems cruel, but we have 8 children in this train. If keeping you puts them at risk." Mrs. Crawford's voice trailed off into uncomfortable silence. Benjamin stepped between them, his young face hard with an anger Margaret had never seen before. "My sister saved a dying man's life. If that makes us dangerous to be around, then maybe we don't want to travel with people who think kindness is evil." Mrs. Crawford flinched as if he'd slapped her. She set the food sack down near their wagon wheel anyway and walked away without another word, her shoulders bent with what might have been shame or relief. As the wagon train prepared for departure, Margaret made one final attempt to change their minds. She found Dr. Williamson checking on the Crawfords' youngest boy, who'd been suffering from a persistent cough. "Doctor, you know what Cherokee medicine can accomplish," she said quietly. "If more people get sick on the trail west, you'll need that knowledge to help them." Williamson barely glanced at her, his attention focused on listening to the child's chest with his stethoscope. Modern medical science doesn't require primitive superstitions, miss. Prayer and proper treatment cure disease, not heathen herb mixtures. Margaret bit back her response about how his proper treatment had nearly killed Emma Morrison while her primitive superstitions had saved the girl's life. Some people would rather cling to familiar failure than embrace unfamiliar success. The sun climbed higher as the wagon train organized for departure. Margaret and Benjamin stood beside the rutted trail, their handcart loaded with everything they owned in the world. Dust kicked up by 50 oxen and 25 wagons would soon be all that remained of their former companions. One by one, the wagons rolled past them. Some families looked away in embarrassment or shame. Others stared with curiosity, as if Margaret and Benjamin were exotic animals they'd never see again. A few children waved from wagon beds until their mothers pulled their hands down. Mrs. Patterson drove the last wagon in line. As she passed, she slowed her oxen to a walk and leaned over to speak quietly. "There's a pouch of medical supplies hidden in your flour sack. And Margaret, what you did took more courage than any of these folks will ever have." Before Margaret could respond, Mrs. Patterson snapped her reins and hurried to catch up with the train. Margaret watched until the woman's wagon disappeared over a distant hill, feeling a small warmth in her chest despite everything. When the last wagon vanished, and silence settled over the prairie like a heavy quilt, Margaret and Benjamin stood alone beneath an endless sky. 40 miles stretched between them and Fort Patterson, with no clear path through the wilderness that lay ahead. Benjamin wiped his eyes with his sleeve, trying to hide tears he was too proud to shed. "Sister, are we going to die out here?" Margaret looked down at her brother, barely 10 years old, already orphaned twice, now exiled because of choices she'd made for both of them. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders until she could barely breathe. "I don't know what's going to happen," she admitted, wrapping her arm around his thin frame. "But I'm not sorry I helped Dakota. And I'm not sorry we're the kind of people who help others when they're hurting." A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the empty grassland. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered, with a lonesome howl that seemed to match the aching loneliness in Margaret's chest. But as she fingered the carved bear stone in her pocket, she remembered something important. Dakota's people knew this land better than any white settler ever would. They understood how to find water, food, and shelter where others saw only empty wilderness, and they remembered acts of kindness. Maybe being cast out by one world meant finding acceptance in another. The question was whether two orphaned children could survive long enough to discover which world would claim them. As they began pulling their handcart north toward an uncertain future, Margaret whispered a prayer that mixed Cherokee blessings her grandmother had taught her with Christian words from Sunday school. In this vast land between cultures, perhaps both kinds of faith would be needed. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, full of dangers and possibilities they couldn't yet imagine. The first child collapsed while gathering buffalo chips for the evening fire. Little Emma Morrison, only 7 years old, stumbled forward with strange red spots covering her arms like scattered rose petals. Her aunt rushed to catch her, as fever claimed the girl's small body. "Mountain fever," Dr. Williamson announced grimly, after examining Emma in her family's wagon. His weathered hands shook slightly as he spoke the words that terrified every pioneer family. "We've seen it before. Spreads fast among children." Margaret stood at the edge of the worried crowd, her heart sinking. She recognized those spots, the burning fever, the way Emma's breathing had grown shallow and quick. 3 more children showed symptoms by sunset: the Crawford twins and young Peter Donnelly. By midnight, 6 families faced their worst nightmare. "This sickness follows death. Mrs. Provides," Crawford declared loudly near the central fire, her voice carrying across the camp. "First that savage brings violence to our peaceful train. Now disease spreads among our innocent babies. The Lord is punishing us for harboring enemies." Her words found eager listeners. Fear made people search for someone to blame, and Margaret felt dozens of eyes turn toward her with suspicion. She pulled Benjamin closer, remembering how quickly scared people could turn dangerous. Dr. Williamson emerged from the Morrison wagon, looking defeated. His medical bag contained only basic supplies: laudanum for pain, mercury pills that often caused more harm than healing, and bloodletting tools that weakened patients further. 3 days of travel from the nearest fort meant no help was coming. "The fever's getting worse," he announced to the gathered families. "Emma's not responding to treatment. I'm afraid we might lose her." Mrs. Morrison began weeping openly. Her husband placed protective arms around her shoulders, while their older son stared at the wagon where his little sister fought for life. The scene broke Margaret's heart, especially when she knew the leather pouch hidden in her belongings contained herbs that could help. Dakota had left her powerful medicine: wild mint for fever, purple coneflower root for infection, and other plants she recognized from her grandmother's teachings. The Cherokee had faced similar sicknesses for countless generations and learned nature's remedies, but convincing these frightened settlers to trust Indian medicine seemed impossible. "Doctor," Margaret approached Williamson quietly, "I have experience with fever sickness. My grandmother taught me remedies that might help." His tired eyes hardened instantly. "Young woman, I appreciate your concern, but these children need real medical care, not folk remedies and superstition." "But what if the real medicine isn't working?" she pressed gently. "Emma's getting worse, despite everything you've tried." "Absolutely not." Mrs. Crawford had overheard their conversation and now stood between Margaret and the doctor like an angry guardian. "You will not touch our children with your savage potions. This disease started after you brought that heathen into our camp." Other mothers nodded agreement, their fear transforming into anger toward the easiest target. Margaret felt the familiar sting of rejection, but this time lives hung in the balance. She thought of Emma's small hands, now burning with fever, and little Peter Donnelly, who reminded her so much of Benjamin. "The herbs I carry could reduce their fever safely," Margaret tried once more. "They've been used for hundreds of years by people who understood these plains long before we arrived." "Witch medicine," someone muttered from the crowd. Dr. Williamson shook his head firmly. "I cannot allow unproven treatments on dying children. These families trust me to provide proper medical care, not gamble with native remedies." Margaret walked slowly back to her wagon, feeling the weight of helpless knowledge. She possessed the power to save those children, but pride and prejudice built walls higher than any mountain. Benjamin waited for her beside their small fire, his young face etched with concern. "They won't listen," she told him quietly. "Even when children are dying? Especially then. Fear makes people hold tighter to what they think they know." Throughout that long night, Margaret lay awake listening to the sounds of suffering from nearby wagons. Parents took turns sitting vigil beside fevered children. Dr. Williamson moved between families, administering treatments that brought no relief. The Crawford twins grew delirious, calling for their mother in voices that grew weaker with each hour. Just before dawn, Margaret made her decision. She couldn't force people to accept her help, but she wouldn't let children die because of adult stubbornness. Some rules were worth breaking when innocent lives were at stake. She gathered her herbs and began preparing medicine by moonlight. The sounds of crying parents filled the camp as morning approached. Emma Morrison's breathing had become so faint that her aunt kept checking to make sure the little girl still lived. Mrs. Crawford sat between her twin boys, dabbing their burning foreheads with cool water that provided no real relief. Margaret moved like a shadow between the wagons, her heart breaking for families who suffered needlessly. The medicine she could prepare would reduce fever quickly and fight infection naturally, but delivering it meant risking everything. If the children recovered, she might finally earn acceptance. If something went wrong, the families would blame her forever. At Emma's wagon, Margaret paused outside the canvas cover. Inside, she could hear Mrs. Morrison whispering prayers for her dying niece. The little girl's labored breathing sounded like autumn leaves, rustling in wind, weak and getting weaker. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking of Dakota's gratitude when fever had broken and healing began. She thought of her grandmother's gentle hands teaching her which plants could save lives. Most importantly, she thought of Emma's bright smile just days before, when the child had offered to share her cornbread with Benjamin. Some choices were bigger than fear. Margaret lifted the wagon cover and stepped inside. A miracle happened while everyone slept. Emma Morrison sat up in her wagon as the sun painted the Texas sky orange and gold, asking for water in a clear voice that hadn't been heard for 3 days. Her fever had broken completely, the dangerous red spots were fading, and her eyes sparkled with returning life. What in heaven's name? Dr. Williamson stared at his young patient in complete amazement. Just hours before, he'd prepared the family for the worst possible news. Now Emma smiled and reached for her doll like any healthy child might do on an ordinary morning. Mrs. Morrison burst into tears of joy, gathering her niece close while her husband stood frozen in shock. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. The dying child had somehow recovered overnight. Families rushed from their wagons to witness what seemed impossible. "Doctor, how did this happen?" Coleman demanded. "Yesterday you said she wouldn't last the night." Williamson shook his head slowly. "I've practiced medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen mountain fever break this quickly. It should have taken weeks of recovery, if she survived at all." Margaret watched the celebration from beside her wagon, knowing exactly what had caused Emma's remarkable healing. During the darkest hour before dawn, she had crept into the Morrison wagon and given the child a careful dose of Dakota's fever medicine wild mint tea mixed with purple coneflower root, prepared exactly as her Cherokee grandmother had taught her years ago. The risk had been enormous. If Emma had taken a turn for the worse, every finger would point toward Margaret as the cause. But seeing the little girl suffer while she possessed the cure had been unbearable. Some chances were worth taking when innocent lives hung in the balance. "Margaret," Benjamin's urgent whisper drew her attention. "The Crawford twins are asking for you. Their mother wants to know if you can help them too." Her heart leaped with cautious hope. Mrs. Crawford approached slowly, her earlier hostility replaced by desperate concern for her sick children. Behind her came other worried parents, whose little ones still burned with fever. "I owe you an apology, Mrs." Crawford said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I spoke harshly yesterday because I was frightened, but if you know something that might save my boys." Margaret nodded toward her medicine bag. "The herbs I use come from generations of healing knowledge. I learned them from my grandmother, who learned from Cherokee healers who understood these plains long before any of us arrived. Indian medicine." Dr. Williamson said the words like they tasted bitter in his mouth. "Medicine," Margaret corrected firmly. "Plants don't care about the color of skin or the language spoken when they heal. They only care about fighting sickness and bringing comfort to those who suffer." She moved between the sick children throughout the morning, carefully measuring doses of Dakota's precious herbs. The Crawford twins received fever-breaking tea that cooled their burning bodies within hours. Young Peter Donnelly's dangerous rash began fading as infection-fighting medicine worked its ancient magic. One by one, death released its grip on children who had been lost just hours before. Lieutenant Morrison arrived from the fort in the late afternoon, expecting to find his niece's funeral. Instead, he discovered Emma playing with wooden blocks beside the family wagon, completely recovered from an illness that typically killed half its victims. "This is unprecedented," he told Coleman in amazement. "Mountain fever doesn't simply disappear overnight." "Miss Whitfield used special herbs," Coleman explained, his previous doubts now replaced by grudging respect. "Turns out that Comanche warrior she helped left her some powerful medicine." Morrison studied Margaret with new interest. "You mean to say that Savage actually helped save these children?" "His knowledge saved them," Margaret replied carefully, "just like my grandmother's Cherokee teachings saved him. Healing wisdom belongs to all people, Lieutenant. We just have to be brave enough to accept it." The officer nodded slowly, processing this unexpected truth. Perhaps there's more to learn from these natives than we assumed. As evening settled over the camp, Margaret found herself surrounded by grateful families who had shunned her just days before. Mrs. Morrison pressed a precious silver locket into her hands as thanks for saving Emma. The Crawford family offered their finest blanket for Benjamin's use during cold nights ahead. Most surprisingly, Dr. Williamson approached her with genuine curiosity, rather than professional jealousy. "Would you be willing to teach me about these herbal remedies?" he asked humbly. Clearly, my medical training missed some important lessons. Margaret smiled, thinking of her grandmother's patient voice, explaining which plants fought fever and which ones healed wounds. "I'd be honored to share what I know, Doctor. Healing works best when different knowledge comes together." Coleman announced that Margaret and Benjamin would travel at the front of the wagon train from now on, close to his own family, where their skills could benefit everyone. The siblings who had been outcasts became valued members of the community almost overnight. That final evening before reaching California, Margaret sat beside the campfire watching Benjamin laugh with children who had previously avoided him. The bone needle Dakota had left caught firelight as she mended a torn shirt, reminding her of connections that crossed all boundaries. In the distance, a lone horseman appeared briefly on a ridge too far to identify, but Margaret's heart recognized the silhouette. Dakota had kept his promise to watch over them during their journey west. She raised one hand toward the horizon, and the distant figure responded before melting back into the darkness. "Do you think we'll see him again?" Benjamin asked, following her gaze. "Maybe not him," Margaret replied thoughtfully. "But we'll meet others who need healing, and others who can teach us new ways to help. That's how medicine grows stronger, when different people share what they know." The wagon train reached Sacramento in late autumn of 1859, carrying families toward new lives and golden dreams. But they carried something more valuable than hopes for wealth: the understanding that healing could bridge any gap between peoples, and that sometimes the greatest medicine came from the most unexpected sources. Years later, when Margaret became known throughout California as a gifted healer who combined traditional medicine with native wisdom, she would always remember the night she chose courage over fear. The night when saving an enemy became the key to saving her own people, and when walking between two worlds revealed itself as the greatest strength of all. Dr. Williamson would establish California's first medical school that welcomed students regardless of their background, teaching that healing knowledge belonged to everyone. The Morrison family would name their next daughter after Margaret, ensuring the story lived on through generations. And somewhere in the vast wilderness, a Comanche hunter would carry scars that reminded him daily that kindness could come from the most unlikely sources. The bone needle Dakota had carved became Margaret's most treasured possession, not because of its practical value for mending clothes and treating wounds, but because it represented a truth that changed everything. Humanity's greatest strength lay not in the barriers people built between themselves, but in their courage to tear those barriers down when healing was needed most.